Lawyers of Reddit, what was your definitely winning this one moment? I had a client who had a pretty severe slip and fall in a pharmacy. In my state, we are not allowed to see surveillance of the subject until after the deposition or other similar testimony is taken. The rule is in place to protect defendants, so we don't coach the client based on what we see in the video. Anyway, we take the deposition, then they send the video. Not 30 minutes later I get a call from opposing counsel wanting to settle. The video revealed that my client had fallen, passed out and peed herself. She was very elderly and very hurt. The manager of the store had an employee put signs out showing wet floor and mop up around the lady, all while she was unconscious, all before calling 911. Settled that one for the policy limits right there. I can't really say I'm proud of this one. It's not a happy case, but it was a pretty sure winner. I represented a client once who had gone through a really rough marriage/divorce several years prior. Child drowned, a couple miscarriages, wife developed postpartum on one, which amplified an existing mental illness. Incredibly sad story. At the time I came into the story, the ex-wife had been in jail for several years, stalking her ex-husband initially, but was still being held because she wasn't competent to stand trial, and I was representing the ex-husband, who just wanted authorization to take over sale of the house so they could finally finish severing ties. Prior to the trial, the wife's pro-se briefs made it seem like she was under the impression they were going to relitigate the divorce, filled with allegations related to the marriage itself. Like I said up thread, she already had mental problems, and it was clear she'd picked up some soft tendencies during her ongoing incarceration. When it actually came to trial, and she was brought in, you could tell she was clearly not well. She was having a conversation with herself, while my client was on the stand giving his explanation of the situation. We didn't really have any witnesses to speak of, this was hardly a major matter, so the ex-wife gave her side after that, and that's when the wheels fell off. She basically went on like she had in her briefs, rambling about the divorce itself, claiming my client had committed adultery, and therefore she was entitled to 100% of all assets, aforementioned soft stuff, some general babbling, etc. The judge we had was a nice guy, for which I'm forever grateful. He was patient with her, kind, reminded her that the initial divorce wasn't the issue, but generally just let her continue to speak her piece for a bit. After a few minutes, he gently shut her down, had the bailiff and guards lead her away, and gave us the authorization. Like I said, it's not a happy oh lord, we are so going to win this case, just a sad situation, but it was probably my surest winner rather than default judgments. When the judge keeps on questioning the other side repeatedly, without me needing to say or submit anything. Definitely have a lot of those moments, especially when you have a tight case, or when the other side's arguments are too flimsy. Through a weird quirk of a shared representation agreement, myself and another lawyer from my firm were both representing parties in the same property litigation case. We get to court, enter our names on the record, and my coworker starts a spiel for the hearing. The defendant, who was seated behind, shouting and interrupting almost immediately without even standing up. His lawyer can't shut him up, and so the judge turns his ire on the defendant. My coworker just sits down. We put our heads down, and the judge proceeds to try our entire case for us by just ripping into this disrespectful defendant. Opposing party, mum, stands up while the justice is speaking, interrupts, and says I can't force my children to do something they don't want to do. For context, the justice was talking about how dad, my client, needed to have some parenting time. Mum had alienated the kids and was claiming that they didn't want to see him. Opposing counsel, who had most definitely not anticipated her client doing this, just lowers her head and closes her eyes. I stand up and say if mum can't control her children, then perhaps she should not be the primary parent. The justice replies, and I'll be available to hear it when you make that application, Mr. Ljoff the law. That said, I knew I had one when mum stood up earlier and questioned the qualifications of the psychologist she had suggested, when said psychologist came back with a report that my client should have parenting time. I was representing a rental company for homes. had to present a case where I had to prove the tenants had been using the house they had rented for an illegal weed farm. They claimed they did have weed in the house, but only for their own recreational use. Apparently there's such a thing as a weed expert, and I asked him to testify about how much weed is considered normal for a joint, how many joints per day a regular user would smoke, etc. Little weed facts, so to speak. With his written testimony I did the math, which I presented during my end statement. With all the weed they had lying around, even if the couple smoked 18 heavy joints a day per person, they had enough for 10 years. That ain't recreational, folks. I knew I had them when I heard the bailiff snort when I presented the numbers. Client was private shuttle bus company which was contracted by the publicly funded regional transit company to pick up elderly and disabled customers, done on a reservation system. Client was sued by a woman alleging that the client didn't pick her up when she called, which was true. She would never make a reservation, instead treated the service like a taxi, and as a result she had to hitchhike into town and stay in a shelter overnight. She claimed that at the shelter someone bit a chunk of her arm off and sued the client for $25,000, small claims maximum. I brought an application to dismiss before this went to trial on the basis that the woman's claim was bound to fail. Google the doctrine of remoteness, among other things. At the application, the woman wore short sleeves. Her arms appeared unbuttoned, signal 1 this was going my client's way. She argued that claim wasn't really about the money or the chunk missing from her arm, but instead she wanted the judge to order that my client pick her up whenever she call. Signal 2, admitting your claim is bogus to the judge is not a good strategy. I obviously objected and argued that this was not the case she brought, and the judge must dismiss. The judge said to the woman, I'm inclined to agree with Mr. Dorcas. What would you say in response to his submission? The woman then lost it on the judge. Signal 3, called her a racist. That's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off. Yelled and swore at her and said her human rights were being violated. The judge was visibly pissed and ordered the woman's case dismissed. I could see the judge gritting her teeth, so I decided to swing for the fences. I asked for an additional order that the woman not be allowed to start any other action against my client without first getting permission of the court. Essentially, I asked for an order that is usually awarded against people who repeatedly and baselessly sued the same defendant. This was the first time the woman sued my client. The judge agreed that such an order would be appropriate and granted it on the spot. I don't think it helped that the woman was continuing to swear at me and the judge throughout this time. I was trying a civil case in New Hampshire in front of a salt of the earth jury. In the back row were 4 women. I called a witness who was an assistant town clerk. She came in without a subpoena voluntarily while on maternity leave. She left her baby at home. She was a lovely, well-spoken and articulate woman who oozed credibility and likability. Her evidence was useful to us, but shouldn't have been fatal to the other side's case. After my direct exam, the other lawyer decides to tear into her with largely irrelevant questions in the harshest, most rude way possible. After one question which reeked of his ashlery, the 4 aiders in the back row all were rolling their eyes and looking at each other, as if to say, you believe this shit? It was right then and there I knew we were winning that one. Hit and run. My client was the one who got hit. Defendant's defense was, it may have been my car, but I had reported it stolen, and it wasn't me behind the wheel of the car. During my client's examination in chief. Me, what were you doing at that time? Client, I was waiting for the pedestrian light to turn green, so that I could cross the street on the zebra crossing. Me, and did you wait for the light to turn green before crossing? Q. Client, yes. The light turned green, and I waited a few seconds before crossing the street. Right then and there, the defendant jumps up and roars across the courtroom. My light was green to Geo. That bloody fucking liar dashed across the street